Greetings, everyone. I'm Ellen Dunlap, President of the American Antiquarian Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual talk. Some of you have joined us before, I know, but for those of you who are new, welcome. As we do likely have some new people with us, let me quickly introduce the Antiquarian Society to you. We're a national research library of American history and culture, whose mission is to collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the British West Indies before the 20th century. In doing so, we collect anything and everything we can printed within these parameters, from graphic prints and ephemera, to newspapers and periodicals, to pamphlets and books. And we use these collections as the basis for all of our programs, such as this one. Before I move to introducing tonight's speaker, I want to point out a couple of features of Zoom webinar that we'll be using for tonight's program. You'll notice down below on your screen that you have both a chat and a Q&A button. And due to the large number of attendees, we'll be using the chat only for informational purposes. My colleagues, Kayla Hopper and Jim Moran, will be co-hosting with me, and Kayla will be posting relevant links there, such as how to order a copy of Professor Mandell's books. And if you have the ability the chat will also give you the ability to contact any of us if there's any technical difficulties we should know about. If you would like to save the chat to retain the links that Kayla posts for future use, you can save the transcription of it by clicking on the three little dots in the chat window. For the Q&A portion of the program at the end of the talk, please use the dedicated Q&A function, not the chat. This will help us keep track of questions, and it also has an upvote function. So if someone else posts the question that you want to see discussed, be sure to give it the thumbs up, the upvote, and it will keep it at the top of the queue. So now for tonight's speaker. We're very excited to have our friend Daniel Mandell with us tonight to talk about his new book, The Lost Tradition of Economic Equality in America, 1600 to 1880, which was published in April by Johns Hopkins University Press, publisher of two of his previous books on the history of indigenous people in New England in the same time period. The Lost Tradition has garnered high praise from reviewers, both for its depth of research that went into it and the clarity of the writing. As one reviewer noted, as Americans now wrestle collectively with how to tackle historically high levels of wealth and income inequality, Mandell's book opens a vista into a vast and inspiring array of conceptual frameworks in stark contrast to those that have dominated recent decades of economic thought. Having received his PhD from the University of Virginia, Dan has taught since 1999 at Truman State University in Missouri, where he is currently professor of history. We at AAS got to know him first when he held a Joyce Tracy Fellowship in 2002, and we were pleased to have him again in residence as an AAS-NEH Fellow for the year 2012-2013. He's been awarded fellowships from Mass Historical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society, Old Sturbridge Village, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And in 2018-19, he was the Distinguished Research Fellow at the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy at the University of Missouri. Dan was elected to membership in AAS in 2014, and it's a great pleasure to have him back at AAS under our dome, virtual dome, though it may be. Dan, please take it away.
Am I on now? Good evening. Thank you, President Dunlap, for the introduction. Thank you all for your interest in joining us tonight. I deeply appreciate the American Antiquarian Society for hosting this talk tonight and providing the AAS-NEH Fellowship that allowed me to do so much of the research and to write several chapters. I began thinking about this project in 2005 when the widening gulf between rich and poor was becoming a major public concern. Few journalists considered the history of the issue, and at best, they went back to the Gilded Age. But I knew from past research that one should go back to the American Revolution when there was this widespread belief that the Republic required a rough equality of property, and that the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few would inevitably corrupt government. I also knew that during Reconstruction, Congress had rejected giving land to the freedmen while extending them the vote. And I wondered about this huge shift from the earlier deep connection between property and polity. So I decided to dig into these issues. Tonight, I'm going to give you an overview of the book. Within its overarching theme, it's essentially a series of case studies. I'm going to give you at least a taste of each chapter while delving more deeply into a few pieces and thereby sketch out the evolution of this American tradition. Nearly all of the sources that I discussed tonight are held by the Society. I look forward to your questions and the discussion at the end. My initial focus when I began my residency at the Society was the origins of these ideas that had appeared during the American Revolution. As I started digging into the sources, I noticed many references to earlier English ideas and writings, particularly the 2 decades between the eruption of the English Civil War and the Restoration. Indeed, my greatest surprise was finding that the ideal of economic equality actually originated in 17th century England. Long-standing belief in a godly hierarchy was undermined by the Renaissance and challenged by new ideas that the unitary nature of God's creation made hierarchy actually sinful. Dutch and English Protestants rediscovered the Jewish tradition of the Jubilee, the great Sabbath held every half century when all debts were canceled, all slaves freed, and all land returned to the original owners. It was during the English Civil War in the 1640s that the notion of human equality exploded into prominence, first with the London Levelers, and then in the more radical economic form by the Diggers, who set up communes, and as you can see in the pamphlet that I've excerpted here, condemned private landholding as original sin before they were squashed by thugs hired by the local landlords. A more secular version, grounded in classical Rome's agrarian laws, entered England's political discourse through James Harrington's Oceana, first published in 1656. In that frequently reprinted novel, Harrington envisioned a prosperous republic grounded on a constitution that gave land to all and placed a limit on wealth. 3 decades later, John Locke in 2 treatises of government argued, like the Levelers, that all men by nature are equal, and like the Diggers, that labor, rather than title, gave value to land. Harrington and Locke, in turn, shaped the ideas of the English radical Whigs in the 1720s, who condemned the increasingly prominent role of wealth and apparent corruption in British politics and called for various political and social reforms. These writers were hugely influential among literate Americans. John Adams, for example, pointed to Harrington's book when emphasizing in several letters that property and power are interwoven. And in fact, this copy of Oceana is from Adams' collection, is currently held by the Boston Public Library. You can see his signature actually in the upper right-hand page. When I looked at the century between the Glorious Revolution, 1689, and the American Revolution, I was fascinated to find that Native Americans became the focus of economic equality in the Anglo-American world in 2 ways. First, Native peoples became for Europeans a symbol of social and economic equality. Locke wrote, for example, that in the beginning, all the world was America, where private property did not exist. And groups of indigenous Americans began to visit England, and on occasion they were quoted in London publications as being astounded at the terrible extremes of poverty and wealth in the capital. This was very much unlike their own societies, as they told their hosts. Second, back in America, the vast lands taken from Native peoples by British colonists provided a far higher level of economic and therefore political equality than across the Atlantic. as the Frenchman turned New Yorker farmer de Crevecoeur enthused in his Letters from an American Farmer, what should we American farmers be without the distinct possession of that soil? On it is founded our rank, our freedom, our power as citizens. So there is this deep irony that on the east side of the Atlantic, indigenous Americans became symbols of equality, while on this side, Euro-Americans largely hated and scorned natives, but approached a rough economic equality by taking their lands and resources. The older British ideas and the actual relative equality in the colonies became significant elements in the developing American Revolution. In the late 1740s, as Boston confronted increasing poverty and political tensions, Samuel Adams published the Independent Advertiser for the town's artisans and laborers. A January 1748 issue featured large chunks of the British radical Whigs' Cato's letters, including their advice, which I excerpt here, that liberty required equality and equality required the community to place limits on the wealth held by individuals. 2 decades later, as bitter conflicts flared over imperial measures like the Stamp Act, literate Americans like Joseph Warren would occasionally reflect on how those acts inflamed America to the highest degree because there was a more equal division of property in America than in England. Thus, 2 decades later, when New Haven Minister Benjamin Trumbull emphasized to the newly elected Connecticut governor and legislators the need to keep property as equally divided among the inhabitants as possible, as you can see here in this excerpt of his discourse, he highlighted an egalitarian Commonwealth ideology that had become increasingly powerful in the colonies during the imperial crisis. That was echoed in Philadelphia in June 1776, when Benjamin Franklin proposed a measure for the new state Pennsylvania state constitution that would have given the legislature the power to take excessive property, the term that the measure would have used, from individuals because concentrations of wealth were a danger to the happiness of mankind. During the war itself, this goal was embedded in the efforts by governments at various levels, especially local powerful committees of safety to implement price regulation. Such regulation had deep roots in English history, with laws forbidding the selling of goods in ways that profited individuals at the expense of the community, especially during times of scarcity. Coordinated regulation began in late 1776 as growing numbers of New England towns decried price gouging and demanded effective regulation. At the end of the year, a regional convention meeting in Providence agreed upon an extensive set of price guidelines to be expanded and enforced by each state. The state legislatures in turn gave the power to town committees of safety to set and enforce those and additional limits as needed. And here you can see one example from the bustling shipbuilding commercial town of Newburyport, which printed up broadsides to be posted all over town, listing the set series of prices and wages set to prevent monopolies and extortion. When Congress received the news about the Providence meeting, it applauded and called for other regions to do something similar. But conflicts over these regulations quickly developed. Some towns opposed the regulations as ineffective, and farmers and artisans accused each other of avoiding or violating the regulations. By May 1777, a writer in the Connecticut Courant argued that price regulations infringe those liberties of those principles of liberty for which we are gloriously fighting, which is actually the first example I found of the argument that the revolution's goals included an individual's right to control property free from community regulation. The continued increase of prices, despite these measures, drove a call for a new regional meeting at the end of July that agreed to end regulations. Although support for the controls remained strong in many parts, and Congress in November called for more regional regulatory meetings, most states refused to pass enabling legislation. However, another wave of massive inflation in early 1779 drove another regulation effort beginning in Philadelphia. On May 25th, 1779, a huge crowd meeting outside the State House voted to investigate leading merchant Robert Morse and other suspected price gougers, push prices back to January levels by regulation, and encourage other towns to pass similar measures. That movement spread south to Williamsburg, Virginia, and north to Boston, where a city town meeting called for a state gathering. 151 towns sent delegates and passed a set of regulations to be expanded and enforced by individual towns. But in the meantime, merchants and artisans in Philadelphia publicly scorned the measures, as you can see in the clipping in the upper right-hand corner, as in principle unjust. And below that, you can see part of the reply of the city's regulatory committee, rejecting their liberal assertions and even asserting that the laborers who had built the ships, and the state in general, retained a vested interest in the services performed by those vessels even after getting their pay, and therefore retained the right to regulate prices that the merchants would pay for the items carried in those ships. Yet, although broad wage and price regulation continued to be supported by many towns, their failure in practical terms finally led the states and Congress to reject them by the beginning of 1780. Now, overall, I found that these wartime controversies generated a growing sense that control of capital as well as land could become a source of inequality and oppression. The Connecticut Courant in December 1777 charged fat and nasty farmers and merchants with buying up state bills of credit and predicted that after the war, those same monopolists, the term they used, would force laws taxing the underpaid mechanics and laborers to repay those notes at face value, and the result would be an uprising, which is exactly what happened in Shays' Rebellion 9 years later. At the same time, the wartime experience fostered a liberal vision of individual economic freedom, which became increasingly dominant in the country even as towns continued into the 19th century to regulate prices of bread, beer, ferries, and other necessities. Also, Americans continued to strongly believe in the need to maintain relative economic equality and to guard against corrupting concentrations of wealth. As the United States celebrated independence, Americans wrote and argued about the future of their new country. While those who were white generally believed that they lived in the most egalitarian conditions in the civilized world, they were concerned about how wealth and power could corrupt the infant republic in the future. Some elites feared that the revolution had loosened dangerous leveling tendencies, but many more feared a future aristocracy of wealth. Nearly all of the 13 states continued to require property ownership by voters and more for office holders, and the economic stagnation towards the end of the war into the 1780s made many fear they would lose their farms and with it the right to vote. More broadly, many called for measures that would help maintain an egalitarian republic. Changing inheritance laws to end the tradition of preserving large estates so that large estates would be broken up over the generations, that was particularly popular. Every state with such laws abolished them by 1800. A fairly strong consensus also urged universal education, although states failed to impose the necessary taxes and structure to support such schools. Some called for limits on individual wealth, although all but a few avoided troubling specifics, probably because they knew about the increasingly powerful belief that natural liberty included a man's right to control his property. Some proposed confiscating excessive amounts of property at death. Thomas Paine, for example, urged an agrarian justice, the title page you can see here, that one should tax estates 10% to create a fund to give every person 15 pounds at age 21 and annual pensions of 10 pounds to every person beginning at age 50. In the 1790s, anxieties in America about economic and social equality intensified with the establishment of new national institutions, new charters for banks and roads, public debt speculation, popular passions over the French Revolution, and the emergence of warring political parties. Men called for more progressive tax laws, an end to property requirements for voting, and size limits on land purchases from the public domain. On the other hand, support for such measures and the French Revolution drove some conservatives to openly scorn the very idea of equality. In part, however, because of such overreach, the passion for equality in 1800 swept Thomas Jefferson into the presidency and the Federalists from power. Now, American society and culture dramatically shifted in the quarter century following Jefferson's election. Perhaps the least significant change was that the men wore pants instead of knee breeches. One of the more significant was the increasing acceptance by Americans of economic equality as a normal, inequality rather, as a normal condition in their country. That was influenced by and reflected in children's literature and education, adult writings on the economy, and the end of property qualifications for voting and office holding. As the price of paper dropped, children's books printed in Northeast cities, many of them in the AAS, a big part of their collection, became common. This literature taught American children and their parents to embrace a hierarchical society where the poor accepted their lot and cherished the wealthy. Ironically, that lesson came largely from English authors. One of the most popular was Hannah More and her cheap repository tracts, shown here. More was already a noted writer in the mid-1790s in England when she began writing stories to impart moral lessons to the children of laborers and influence their parents against the dangerous ideas of the French Revolution. Many of her stories taught that a strong class structure was natural and beneficial. The wealthy earned their status through hard work, while the virtuous poor should be grateful, and were grateful, to escape the heavy responsibilities faced by gentlemen. These stories were reprinted in New England, Philadelphia, and New York into the 1840s. Similarly, Lindley Murray's English Reader, first published in England and New York in 1799, used as the main reader in Boston schools in the Northeast generally until the 1830s, repeated in various forms the lesson that the rich man had worries that the poor escaped. Murray emphasized that social stability required a distinction of ranks based on property, and that these classes kept to their own at public events. His Reader remained the most popular school book in America for even during the age of Jackson. Now, these English stories seem inappropriate for a democratic egalitarian nation because they embraced inequalities in power and wealth. On the other hand, these stories did highlight values that Americans considered fundamentally Republican, that people should be valued equally with regards to their virtue, intelligence, and actions. And indeed, after 1830, as American authored children's literature increasingly dominated the market, books like McGuffey's Reader repeated these same moral lessons that great wealth was justified by hard work and one's economy. During the same period, American adults avidly read and argued about their nation's political economy, which was actually a term invented at the time. As cities mushroomed and mass production forged a class structure of very wealthy owners at the top and transient wage laborers at the bottom, merchants and elite allies increasingly jettisoned the egalitarian ideals that had marked the early republic. They embraced unregulated rights to property and capital, abandoned older concerns about luxury and greed, and often depicted the poor as morally dangerous. These new views of political economy also originated in England, in the writings of Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. They wrote that it was inevitable and necessary that poor laborers should suffer and the wealthy become richer, that that was good for society. My favorite outlet for these ideas was a book supposedly for children, Jane Marset's Conversations on Political Economy, shown here. Marset envisioned a conversation between a teacher and an adolescent student in which the teacher persuaded the student that the poor were indolent. Great wealth created employment, and that laws setting a minimum wage so people could afford bread were wrong and even counterproductive. This 400-page mind-numbing tome was printed in Philadelphia 1 year after its 1816 London debut and republished in New York, Boston, and elsewhere afterwards. Within decades, such ideas were embraced by many elite Americans. Francis Wayland, shown here, president of Brown University and pastor of the Providence First Baptist Church, regularly lectured to the senior class about how riches and intelligence were God's rewards for industry, so that, as he wrote in his Elements of Political Economy, it is necessary that every man be allowed to gain all that he can. In other words, greed is good, while public aid to the poor fostered bad habits and insubordination. Yet the tradition of economic equality remained a potent force. Americans increasingly saw capital instead of government as the main threat to the republic. They voiced hostility to the creation of new corporations, particularly banks. As manufacturing became a major force in the Northeast, fears grew that a wealthy few would corrupt the country and impoverish everyone else. In 1817, New York City doctor Cornelius Blatchley published a call for a Christian socialist commonwealth, insisting, as I excerpt here, that God gave land to men collectively, like the diggers had said, that individuals could claim a piece only if they farmed or lived on it, and that when they died, the property should be redistributed in equal shares to every child in the nation. He helped form the New York Society for Promoting Communities and wrote their constitution, which pointed to property rights as the cause of all social evil. This unhappiness with the course of America's political economy swelled in the 1820s as the Panic of 1819, the first major depression in the country, intensified emerging class conflicts and drove the formation of the working man's movement. In 1826, Landon Blilesby, a journeyman proofreader in New York City, wrote Observations on the Sources and Effects of Unequal Wealth, the first published American condemnation of mass production as the source of the inequality of wealth and its intended evils. At the same time in Philadelphia, the immigrant shoemaker William Hyton worked with other journeymen to establish Mechanics Association to push for systemic reforms, and wrote for it a constitution that condemned the unequal and very excessive accumulation of wealth and power. That organization established a library and the first labor newspaper in the country, but floundered in its effort to elect candidates to local offices. Back in New York, in 1829, machinist Thomas Skidmore published The Rights of Man to Property, highlighting community consent as a source of property rights and calling for the state to redistribute all property and, like Blatchley, in the future to take property at death and redistribute it to men and women at the age of 18. He also organized a huge public gathering that endorsed the right of workers for a comfortable living and wrote resolves later adopted by a second mass meeting that called for various reforms, including every person to be given an equal amount of property at adulthood. But such language alarmed others, who organized a competing faction that proclaimed the individual right to property sacred and ran their own ticket, weakening the movement in the city. Between 1828 and 1834, working men's parties mushroomed throughout the United States, from Alabama to New Orleans to Buffalo and Rochester. All condemned the aristocracy of wealth and called for various social and economic reforms. All in the movement focused on the interests of labor in opposition to employers, and called economic power the primary source of oppression. In fact, both sides in this 19th century debate spoke increasingly in terms of class conflict rather than the older language of Republican consensus. This debate was also almost entirely in secular terms, perhaps reflecting the broader divide emerging in this country between church and state. The same period saw the uncoupling of politics and property, as most states held constitutional conventions that almost entirely eliminated property requirements to vote and hold office. This was not universally embraced. Federalists, like the nation's foremost legal educator, James Kent of New York, shown here, continued to believe and insisted in the New York Constitutional Convention that disconnecting suffrage from property posed a danger to the Republic. But the majority held that the state was a community of persons rather than property. Unfortunately, these new democratic masculine norms were attached to the scourge of racism, and by 1840, nearly every state constitution explicitly limited the vote to white men. This is not a new story. Historians have highlighted it for decades. But what we generally haven't noted is that these changes also snapped the traditional connections between political and economic equality, and removed a critical motivation for dealing with the rapidly widening divide between rich and poor, further marginalizing the American tradition of economic equality. By the middle of the century, Americans increasingly agonized over the rising tide of excessive wealth flaunted by an elite class, along with the increasingly obvious poverty suffered by many. As conditions worsened in the wake of the crash of 1837, a growing number of Americans sought alternatives. The first alternative was Communitarian Life. Originally, that took a religious form, with the Shakers, whose settlements expanded rapidly in the 1800s. In the early 1840s, Albert Brisbane, pictured here, returned from France and began working to implement the socialist ideas of Charles Fourier. Fourierism explained poverty as the result of the free market economy and power exerted by the wealthy, with the solution being communitarian farms and workshops. This appealed to a wide range of Americans. And by 1846, there were about 24 Fourier groups in cities and 26 Fourier settlements between Massachusetts and Iowa, including the famous Transcendentalist commune, Brook Farm, depicted in this painting. Another alternative, of free homesteads on the public lands and deep reforms for urban laborers, came from the National Reform Association. The NRA was formed in New York City on February 8, 1844, by the former Working Man's Party editor George Henry Evans and a handful of other activists. They called for individual settlers to be allowed to claim up to 160 acres from public lands, but only for lifetime tenure. A settler could sell the improvements, and with it the rights to the land, but only to other settlers lacking land. Those lots would be surveyed in townships organized around a public square made up of small lots including a townhouse, so an organized community, not isolated frontier cabins. This was agrarian labor socialism that embraced patriarchal households and existing property rights. The goals were endlessly promoted in NRA publications, from its annual almanacs to its newspapers, The Working Man's Advocate and Young America, even its ornate membership certificates, all of which are held by the AAS. The NRA's platform had its seeds in Jefferson's vision of federal land policies and in the Jacksonian rhetoric that low-wage labor was a form of slavery. The NRA also ignored the indigenous peoples who lived where the landless laborers were supposed to settle. The NRA immediately moved to build alliances with labor and communalist organizations. By 1846, the association's call for land and labor reform had gained the endorsement of many newspapers around the country, including Horace Greeley in his New York Tribune, and a growing chorus of groups around the country. They got thousands of Americans to sign petitions asking Congress to end the sale of public lands and allow Americans without land to claim farms and house lots. Not surprising, some congressmen, including Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, actually, began sponsoring homestead laws. But the end of the second party system also spelled the end of the NRA, as some of its key leaders helped organize the Free Soil Party and later the Republican Party. But petitions to Congress for a homestead law continued. and for over a decade, the House would pass such a bill only to see it killed in the Senate. A Homestead Act finally became law in May 1862 after Southern states left the Union, but that law still allowed individuals to buy an unlimited amount of federal land and to sell it to someone else without limits. While the NRA's initial push made this law possible, and George Evans is sometimes called the father of the Homestead Act, ironically, his organization probably would have opposed the measure because of its primary desire to limit, as it put it, land monopoly. In the 1860s, as the War for the Union became a campaign to end slavery in the South, the religious and secular traditions of economic equality together drove a strong call to confiscate plantation lands and redistribute it to freedmen. Congress considered slave emancipation and land confiscation as two aspects of the same goal. By mid-1863, Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, shown here, were urging the redistribution of plantation lands to those formerly forced to work it. In January 1865, General Sherman's Field Order 15 confiscated huge swaths along the southeast coast and redistributed to freed families in 40-acre allotments. And about a month later, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau with the duty to rent up to 40 acres of abandoned or confiscated land to freedmen at low rates. But after Lincoln was assassinated in April, President Andrew Johnson ordered the return of confiscated land to the former rebels. Although some Bureau and Army officers sought to slow restoration, and freedmen in settlements like this one depicted in North Carolina, Congress rejected proposals to break up large plantations and redistribute the land. Even though Republicans acknowledged that freedmen faced high barriers, despite the strong voices of men like Stevens, the Republican consensus in Congress was that a free labor market and the right to vote was sufficient. Given the history that I've traced, this myopic focus on the transcendent power of the vote seems puzzling. Anglo-American traditions envisioned widespread property ownership as foundational elements in a Republican polity. Also, the labor theory of value, which had long been an article of faith among Americans, strongly supported the freedmen's right to lands from which their unpaid labor for generations had brought forth great wealth for others. In fact, Congress's desire to extend the franchise while refusing to eliminate those barriers highlighted how fundamental changes in the nation since 1800 had marginalized the tradition of economic equality. While the racism, which I do detail in this chapter, was a factor, more significantly, the debates over confiscation and redistribution demonstrated that the ideology of sacred private property had largely supplanted the revolution's ideal that the Republic had the responsibility to prevent concentrations of great wealth or grinding poverty. While that tradition of economic equality did survive at the margins, as witnessed by a series of writers and movements that I briefly sketch in the epilogue through the Occupy Wall Street movement, that tradition was largely forgotten. The origins of that tradition was largely forgotten by Americans. My hope is that my book will help return this tradition to our public culture. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Your book brings up so many interesting ideas that call to my mind such a different interpretation of what so many people are thinking that they know about how it used to be in our country. We encourage everybody to type your questions into the chat, the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And Kayla will tee them up for me to pose to Dan. And Dan, we have one question that several people have highlighted, and it has to do with public common institutions, schools. The commenter, Johan Neem, starts by saying, "I love your book!" exclamation mark. You really help us see what was lost with the abandonment of the Republican ideal of equality. Question: how do you make sense of the paradox that the expansion of public common institutions, i.e. schools, promoted ideas of individualism and inequality that contradicted the very premise of why we need public common institutions?
It is a paradox. I really think the literature that developed, the children's literature that developed, became the school books that were used in these schools. And they taught this lesson that individuals were responsible for their own economic condition. And it meshed with the increasingly dominant perception in American culture that individuals should have the right to use their property without any constraints, without any social constraints. So it is a paradox, but it's part of the broader current in American culture, like education itself.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. What do you make of the fact that post-Reconstruction and post-civil rights were times of particularly pronounced rises in inequality? Or do you see it that way?
Well, yes, clearly. And I think there's a couple of elements involved in that. One is that the political parties that existed during and after the Civil War largely abandoned, actually completely abandoned the older ideas of economic equality and embraced instead either extreme individualism or support for corporate power. And at the same time, corporations grew in size and power, became national instead of just state or regional in their extent. I mean, this is, after the Civil War, this is the rise of Andrew Carnegie's Steel Empire and others. And so when workers tried to revive working men's movement and to try and regain some voice in the way things were going, which is an older tradition in the Anglo-American world, they were squashed. They were put down by force. And that, in a nutshell, pretty sums up what happened. There was actually the closest we've ever come to a general strike in this country came in 1877 in the wake of the war, starting with the railroads and moving out from there when whole cities were shut down. But then troops were called in and that was squashed. And that was pretty much I won't say it was the end of the workers' movement, but it was clearly marginalized for a while, along with any ideas of economic equality. Instead, great wealth and the uses of great wealth became celebrated by novelists until, of course, we get to Sinclair and the octopus. As far as recently, post-civil rights, I think that's true as well. One of the things that happened, of course, in the 1970s, 1980s, is that the Keynesian economic ideas that were embodied in the New Deal were rejected by both parties, it seems, both by neoliberals among Democrats, and then, of course, by Republicans, as represented by Ronald Reagan. And then after, that kind of ended regulations. And certainly that happened beginning the late 1970s with the end of regulations for airlines and other things. And that the dogma under neoliberalism became that big was better, big was efficient. And unfortunately, that also meant that big money became bigger. Mm-hmm. So that was certainly one of the effects of the neoliberalism that emerged after the civil rights movement.
We have a question about land and natural resources. Was the original structure of equality enabled by the relatively easy exploitation of land and natural resources, while in recent years there are fewer resources to exploit?
That's a good question. Because, of course, wealth was based largely on land in the 17th and 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, wealth was increasingly based on industry and production of that kind. I'll leave that for someone else to investigate.
Okay.
I think there are ways that economic equality could have continued. There are, I mean, some of the plans that have been launched or proposed, an annual guaranteed income, for example, controls on corporate structures, things like that could perform some of the same needs, meet some of the same needs in our more modern economy.
Here's a question having to do with voting rights. Why did broadened voting rights not translate to demands for more economic equality?
Because quite simply, I think that in terms of the larger stream of American history, when that became the norm, we celebrated voting. We put voting on a pedestal and celebrated democracy as the be-all and end-all, political democracy as the be-all and end-all. And the economic side of that became secondary. There were clearly times when that later, after 1850, when that wasn't the case, right? I mean, you saw that in the NRA. The NRA was trying to elect politicians who promised to change the situation, to distribute land more equally. And then in the 1870s, 1880s, issues of greenbacks and union rights and so on became tied into electoral politics. Then, of course, during the New Deal, you saw the same thing, right? New Deal, economic equality, the efforts to make America fairer in terms of its economics became the platform of the Democratic Party. And in fact, the New Deal, if you look at the statistics, the inequality was reduced during and in the wake of the New Deal. So the policies worked and they were promoted by the Democratic Party.
I have a personal question about what you were saying about the land before 1800 and how the idea was about breaking up the land. And I think of that time period as one in where entail was prevalent and was ways of keeping land in families, but I guess only to certain members of the family, right?
Yeah. Well, and primogenitor and entail work together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The English law was the intestate law. If you died without a will and you had a lot of land, it would always go to the eldest son. If you left a will, you might be able to will to more children, but the norm was one son would get it all, the eldest one. And entail was, of course, a limit on the what could be done with the land over many generations. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony set itself up and created laws, they built a lot of their laws on biblical principles, one of which was that the eldest son gets a double portion and all the younger sons get a portion as well, but a smaller one. And that's the way they treated land. Some other colonies copied that, but particularly south of what became the Mason-Dixon line, the southern colonies copied the English pattern, Virginia, South Carolina, and so on. So they had entail and they had primogenitor. Thomas Jefferson and others, Virginians and some South Carolinians during the Revolutionary War, when ideas of republican equality became common currency, the one agrarian law, which is what they considered this, agrarian law that they embraced was ending entail and ending primogenitor, so that from generation to generation, these great estates, if someone did manage to put a large estate together, would be broken up. Of course, at the time, people generally had large families, lots of kids. So this became the ideal. Now, it didn't always happen that way. Entail requires the state to provide the legal structure to enforce the restrictions. So when the states like Virginia ended entail, that was it, okay? But when they ended primogenitor, they didn't ban it. Virginia just said, intestate laws from now on, the land will be divided equally among the sons. So men could still will their property to one elder son, which actually became kind of the norm in the plantation cotton economy. The eldest son would get all the plantation, and actually when a daughter married, the daughter would get slaves as the dowry.
This next question is about land and slaves. Do you think the abandonment of reparations and the idea to break up plantations and redistribute land to freedmen was an attempt to make sure the South would not try to rise again, to go back to war? Johnson, clear racist among other things, may have thought that keeping Southerners on their land would pacify them, perhaps?
Yes. One reason that the Republicans in Congress, Sumner, Stevens, and others gave for breaking up the plantations and redistributing the land to freedmen, one reason was indeed not simply to keep the Southerners from going back to secession and war, but to completely transform the Southern economy. I mean, when the term Reconstruction was used, they were talking about completely reconstructing the whole structure of Southern society and the economy. And so breaking up the plantations was in part to give freedmen the land that they deserved after working and all this, but it was also about creating a small d democratic society from an aristocratic pre-war structure. When Johnson, that was an intention. When Johnson gave the land back to the plantation owners or their families, because some of these plantation owners had died during the war, and so he's giving the land back to the heirs. It seemed entirely about racism. It seemed, or well, mostly about racism, and he simply, as long as the plantation owners were willing and eager to beg his forgiveness, he was happy to give the forgiveness. So it was kind of an ego thing with him too. Before the war, he hated large plantation owners. He was the senator from Tennessee. He was the only senator who stayed in Congress when his state seceded, which is why he was rewarded actually with military governorship and then later the vice presidency. And he took great glee in having plantation owners need to come to him and plead for his forgiveness, essentially, in which case he was happy to give them back their land. He saw that as a way perhaps to ensure stability, but he was really interested in a little bit of revenge and reestablishing a white man's states after the war.
Fascinating. We've come to the, wait, I have one more question, if we can slip this in. Based on your research, do you have a personal opinion about which of the ideas that are currently in the public discourse, such as universal basic income you mentioned, and increased wealth tax, corporate regulations, might be most successful at reducing inequality in America?
I am not an economist. However, I am particularly attracted by some proposals, like Elizabeth Warren has proposed very interesting national incorporation law, which frankly we should have had some time ago. There's no reason why corporations, corporate license could come out of state when you have these national, even international corporations. And a proposal would require every corporation of above a certain, every company above a certain size to get a national incorporation license, and along with that, they would be required to have representatives of labor and other stakeholders on their board, which would give a more, shall we say, populist shade to corporate decision making. So I like that. I also like a larger estate tax. I mean, frankly, it's a scandal that the estate tax in the United States should be so small. Remember, the original goal of the revolutionaries was to prevent concentrated wealth and prevent concentrated wealth from growing over generations, and that's exactly what's happening right now. And a larger, better enforced estate tax would be a major step to going back to the original intentions of the founders.
Thank you for sharing those ideas. We're almost at the bewitching hour of 9 o'clock. And I just want to invite everybody to please join us for our next virtual public program on Thursday, October 15th at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. This program will feature a panel presentation in celebration of 25 years of the Creative and Performing Artists and Writers Fellowship Program here at AAS. We've asked 3 of our artist fellows, all of whom created works exploring life in 17th century New England from varying perspectives, to discuss their work, their creative processes, and their experiences conducting research in the archive. And then 1 week later, on Thursday, October 22nd, again at 8 o'clock, we will have the pleasure of virtually hosting Alan Taylor for a reconsideration of his Pulitzer Prize winning book from 1995, William Cooper's Town, Power and Persuasion on the Frontier of Early America. So you'll find more information and registration links for these and our other virtual programs on our website. And if you're not already on our mailing list, you may sign up through the link that Kayla has posted in the chat. Just a reminder that you can save the transcription of the chat for later use by clicking on those 3 dots. So I hope you'll join us again, and I hope you will all join me in thanking Dan Mandell for a really fascinating and eye-opening presentation. Good luck with the book, Dan. I think it's a great read. Thank you very much for sharing it.
Thank you very much.